In episode 3, all Alfie can think about is the money, but he should also consider the fact that the war is reached London. Bombs are getting dropped, windows are getting blown out, and it's becoming a regular occurrence. He's actually woken up one morning by such an attack, goes downstairs to find his mother bandaging up a little girl. But he doesn't really think about it too much because he has to get to work. And as he's heading into the club, he runs into Martha Kane, but she acts like she doesn't know him. And he stops her and says, "What, you're just not going to talk to me?" And that is precisely what Martha was planning on doing. She yells at him because she thought he was an honorable man, and after the stunt he pulled with Salt, she no longer thinks that. She basically gives him the, "I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed" speech that my father gave me way too often. He tries to change the subject, saying how he saw Thomas Wayne at the club, and he was talking to Aleister Crowley, which he found weird. And Martha definitely finds that pretty bizarre. But as those two were talking outside, inside of the club, Boz and Dave Boy also can't get the fact that the money was stolen out of their head. That's when a guy named Ken the Spot walks up. And Ken is trying to sell a ring to anybody. He's one of these guys that always has something to sell and always seems to know what's going on in the neighborhood. So at first they yell at him because he knows that they don't have the money to buy a ring. But then they ask him, "What have you heard?" And he tells them nothing. If I had heard something, I'd tell you. But Dave Boy doesn't really believe that. So he grabs the guy by his tie, pulling his head close to the table and putting a knife at his throat, demanding to know what he knows. And that's when Alfie walks in, putting a stop to it, because he doesn't believe that Ken actually does know. He sits down and tells them both that he had a really weird dream that featured his father, and the dream made him realize that the thief has got to be Gully Troy. He's the only other guy that knew that he had money. Knowing Gully, Dave Boy and Baza don't believe for a second that he would do it, but Alfie's pretty convinced that he did, and he figures he's got to get an answer, so he's just going to go find Gully and ask him himself. He heads over to Gully's place where he meets Mrs. Troy, someone he had no idea who existed. And flirtation is Mrs. Troy's superpower. I mean, she's dressed in a bathrobe. She's giving off some pretty heavy doomy vibes. And she tells Alfie, "I'm aware of you," but Alfie tells her, "Oh, I had no idea you existed. I really just came here to find out where Gully is." This dance goes on a little bit longer, but eventually she relinquishes the location of her husband. And Gully is in a warehouse with his team building themselves an armored car. Even though he was a captain in the army, he's kind of turned to a life of petty crime. But it's scaling upwards. Gully's excited to see Alfie, but that smile quickly evaporates when Alfie tells him the reason he's there. And Gully can't believe that he's being accused of this. Gully says, "Well, somebody in your inner circle is probably talking. I mean, I'm ruthless, but I'm not dishonorable." Now that it's settled that Gully didn't do it, the conversation turns a little bit more casual, with Gully offering Alfie a job. He wants Alfie to come and work for him. And while that is enticing because he has a really good relationship with Gully, he explains that he doesn't want to work for anybody, even one of his friends. Even if he knew it would be a good situation, he wants to be his own boss. He also doesn't want to get in a robbery, but Gully continues to push, saying that he'd hire Baza and Dave Boy because he's got these two big jobs coming up. But in the end, Alfie turns him down. Alfie heads home because he has to get ready for work that night, and his mom tells him that the girl that was on the couch earlier in the morning is going to make a full recovery. In fact, Mrs. Pennyworth actually saved the girl's life. Right as he's about to leave, his mom tells him, "I'm sorry you lost all your money, but I am glad you're not going to America." And Alfie looks at her and says, "Who said I'm not going to America?" And then he heads off to work. When he gets there, Dave Boy and Baza are at the bar. The club hasn't opened yet, and they're just having a drink before work. Alfie fills them in on the fact that Gully didn't do it, and as they're talking about who possibly could have, they all notice that Sherry, the girl behind the bar, who Dave Boy has been hitting on nonstop, is flashing a pretty nice-looking ring, a ring that looks an awful lot like the one that Ken was trying to peddle off on them earlier in the day. They ask her where she got it because they know that she can't afford it. They ask her who gave it to her, and she says a guy named Vic Dobson, which really flusters Dave Boy because he can't believe that she won't go out with him, but she'll go out with Vic Dobson of all people. But the bigger concern is the fact that they know that Vic doesn't have the money. And that's when Dave Boy admits that he got drunk one night and he was getting made fun of by a couple of guys. So he pulled out a $100 bill, slapped it on the table, and said there's more where that came from. He didn't know who he did that to, though, because he was drunk. But now they have a pretty good idea that the person must have been Vic. So at this point, opening up the club is the last thing on anybody's mind. They put Sherry in the car and they drive over to Vic's place. and Vic is living in a trailer located in what looks like an abandoned pop-up carnival. They're not really concerned about Vic since they know him. They don't really feel the need to get the lay of the land and all that. But Dave Boy and Baza spread out, and Alfie has Sherry yell Vic's name. It doesn't take more than about a minute for a firefight to break out between Baza, Dave Boy, and Vic's guys. Alfie decides to wait by Vic's car, and it ends up paying off because Vic tries to sneak out the back door with Alfie's money. And when he's spotted by Alfie, he runs into a house with mirrors. But Alfie's mean streak ends up coming out. He doesn't give a damn about the mirrors. He ends up pushing Vic through most of them. All that pent-up frustration about the fact that Vic kidnapped his mother and stole his money is flowing out of him, and he's kicking the crap out of Vic. But unfortunately for Alfie, he makes one step on some weak wood, and his leg goes through it, and he's kind of trapped. It gives Vic the opportunity to pull out his knife and head towards Alfie, but there was a reason why Alfie wasn't all that concerned with this guy. He's not a great fighter. And even though Alfie basically is a one-legged man at this point who's trapped, he's able to fight Vic off and stab him in the neck. Alfie, however, can't free himself from the floor. So with one hand grabbing the bag of money and the other hand trying to keep his neck from splurting out blood, Vic heads outside and tries to escape, and that's when Sherry sees him. Vic ends up dying in Sherry's arms, and by the time that Alfie ends up freeing himself and coming out, they notice that the bag of money is gone, and that's when they see Sherry speeding away. Baza runs into the street to try to stop her, but he doesn't end up firing a bullet, although it doesn't really matter. Sherry's not a good driver, ends up crashing into a bunch of oil barrels, and Baza's car goes up in flames. Sherry's dead, the money is burning, but when the vehicle exploded, it ended up tearing up Baza pretty good. The boys race to his aid, but his guts are literally hanging out of him. He's not going to make it. So it's a pretty emotional goodbye for the three friends, and they promise Baza that they will make it to America. Now, as I said, the war is raging on, and the bad news for the No Name League is the fact that Aleister Crowley's methods have worked. He was able to seduce the Archbishop into partaking in an orgy. Then he took pictures of it and sent it to the press. So there's the Archbishop all over the front page with a bunch of naked people, not a good look. He's going to be out of a job. The Archbishop, not being able to handle the disgrace, ends up committing suicide. This is going to be a problem for the league because they're once again looking for a prime minister. But as they're talking about who could replace him, they're also talking about how ridiculous all of this is. It doesn't make any sense. They know the Archbishop. They know he's not that kind of guy. And that's when the Queen brings up that Aleister Crowley must have gotten to him. That name really piques interest with Martha, and it suddenly hits her. This must have had something to do with Thomas Wayne. There's no other reason why Wayne would even want to link back up with Aleister. So to get some answers, Martha heads over to Thomas's office and questions him about it. And while he feels gross and he wants to explain himself, the only words he can muster are, "Nobody wanted him dead." And that's when a disgusted Martha Kane slaps Thomas in the face and walks out. But what's going on with the Archbishop is great news for the Raven Union. After Salt, Gaunt, and Hardwood have a good laugh about it, Gaunt mentions to Hardwood that he's looking run down. He probably needs a break. But he tells her, "I can't. We got a war going on." As he's looking over some documents for Salt, his secretary walks in and lets him know that somebody is on the line who's been calling nonstop looking for him. Her name is Bet Sykes. Francis, Gaunt, and even Salt beg him not to take that phone call. They know that Bet Sykes is unstable and not good for business. But Hardwood, who feels a connection with Sykes and also feels indebted to her, tells his secretary to put the call through. Bet and Katie ended up at the house of one of Katie's old art teachers. You can tell that Katie really admired this guy, but that doesn't really matter to Bet. She comes in hot, aggressive, and rude. After explaining it's at the house where she made the phone call. After getting some pleasantries out the way, she ends up telling Hardwood about the fact that she killed a superior officer and he wants him to kind of fix it. Like a puppy who just pissed on the carpet, Hardwood admonishes her, but it's more of a, this can't happen again. And then he tells her that he's going to send a car to pick her up and bring her back. For that, he gives the location to Salt, telling him to send a car with his best men to pick up Bet Sykes. But nobody thinks this is a good idea except Hardwood. Both Francis and Salt try to convince him otherwise, but he ends up yelling at him that he's the boss. He doesn't need their opinion. When Bet gets off the phone, she heads in the living room where she's found Katie and her teacher clearly talking about Bet. They deny it, but they were. It's not like the teacher hasn't noticed that Katie and Bet really don't mix. And even after Katie explains to her teacher that Bet saved her life and she feels like they could be friends, the teacher's just worried for his former pupil. But Katie's only gotten a glimpse of Bet Sykes' short temper. And there's one thing that Bet can't get over. She doesn't believe that Katie is an art student. Even though they're sitting in the house of Katie's former teacher, who is clearly an artist, he's got paintings and drawings all over his house. Bet demands that Katie start drawing something, so Katie does. But that's when the cops show up. The teacher runs outside to yell for help, but he gets shot up. And then those, quote, police turn their attention to the house, lighting it up with bullets. Katie and Bet are able to barely escape out the back door and get away. Thank you so much for checking out this recap. Please consider subscribing to the channel and subscribing to my Patreon. Hit thumbs up if you liked it. Smash that thumbs down button if you thought it sucked. If you left a comment, I don't get back to you. I usually don't check the comments unless they're like a super comment. Also, if you don't see the next video up on the end screen, not to worry, it'll be up in a day or two.